Ahmose's struggle. 1. The life of the pharaonic family in the diaspora was not a life of ease and idleness, but it was a life of work and preparation for the distant future, and it was all revolved around the heart of Tututuri, who did not know despair or rest. From the beginning of her arrival, she asked the ruler of the south to invite skilled Nubian craftsmen and Egyptian technicians residing in Nubia to factories. So the man sent his messengers to Arco, Atlal, and other countries of Nubia, and they brought him craftsmen and workers. The great queen obliged her son to entrust them with the manufacture of weapons, helmets, military clothing, and the building of ships and battle wheels. She said to him to encourage him, "One day you will attack the enemy who usurped your throne and owned your country. If this day comes, you must attack with a large fleet and invincible will force, as the enemy did with your father." During the 10 years, Nabat transformed into a large factory for the manufacture of ships, wheels, and all kinds of military machinery, and its fruits grew over the days and became the pillars of new hope. When the men came with the first convoy, they found the weapons and equipment they needed now abundant, so they began training with hearts full of enthusiasm and sincere hope. So the day after their arrival in Nabata, they all joined the soldier corps, and were trained in martial arts and the use of various weapons under the supervision of the officers of the Egyptian garrison. Their training did not let them rest, as they worked from the beginning of dawn until sunset. They were all working, there was no difference between the big and the small. King Ahmose personally supervised the training of the soldiers, the formation of the corps of the various divisions, and selected the fit ones for the fleet, assisted by Crown Prince Ahmose. The 3 queens and the little princess refused to work except with the workers, so they were marking and spraying arrows, or they were busy sewing clothes. They continued to mingle with the soldiers and craftsmen and eat and drink with them to encourage them and strengthen their hearts. How wonderful was the sight of Mother Tututuri as she set about her work with tireless energy, or walking among the soldiers watching their training and giving them words of enthusiasm and hope. When the men saw her, they would forget themselves and give up their enthusiasm. So the woman smiles with joy, and says to those around her, "Ships and wheels will turn into graves for those on them if hearts harder than iron do not push them. Look at the men of Thebes, how they work. One of them will pounce on 10 shepherds with dirty beards and white skin, and break their hearts." The truth is that men, through the power of enthusiasm, love, and hatred, have turned into ferocious beasts. Hajir went off to prepare the second convoy, so he doubled the ships and filled them with gold, silver, dwarfs, and exotic animals. Mother Tututuri decided to carry with him groups of loyal Nubians to guide them to the masters of Thebes so that they would be outwardly slaves and inwardly helpers, stabbing the enemy in the back if he engaged in a clash with them one day. The idea appealed to the king, as did the Chamberlain Awa, and he worked to realize it without hesitation. Ha finished preparing for his caravan and asked permission to travel. Prince Ahmose was waiting for that hour with a heart exhausted by longing and exhausted by the weather, so he asked permission to leave at the head of the caravan, but the king, knowing the events that had happened to him and the dangers he had been exposed to, refused to risk his travel again without urgent. He said to him, "O prince, your duty now calls you to stay in Nabata." So the prince was upset by his father's words, who poured on the burning hope in his chest like cold water is thrown on a raging ember, and said to him with sincere hope, "Seeing Egypt and mingling with its people is a cure for the illness that afflicts my heart." The king said, "You will find complete recovery on the day you enter as an invader at the head of the Salvation Army." The young man returned the hope, saying, "Father, I have always promised myself a good vision soon." The king said firmly, "We will not wait long, so be patient until the hour of struggle arrives." The young man realized from the king's tone that he had said his last word, and he was afraid of his anger if he returned to hope, and he bowed his head as a sign of submission and acceptance, and he felt the pain cutting through his heart and holding his breath, but he held himself together, braved, and went to the camp where the men were trained, with a sad and gloomy heart, and his day was spent in hard work. He did not have time to spend his day except a short hour before sleep, and in his privacy he would call out the sweet memories And his imagination would wander around the beautiful cabin of the pharaonic ship that witnessed the hour of farewell, the most creative beauty and the most gentle passions, and he imagined that he heard the melodious voice muttering, saying, "To the meeting," and then he sighed from the depths of his heart. He says sadly and sadly, "Where is the meeting? It is the farewell after which there is no meeting again." However, in those days Nabata was a reality that made a man forget himself and his worries, and confined him to preoccupation with what was more urgent and more dangerous. The men worked hard and struggled without interruption. When a good wind blew over them and they were shaken by longing for those who had left them behind its walls, they sighed for a while and then focused on what was between them. They held their hands with greater determination, and days passed by, not believing that there was anything in this world other than work, or that there was anything in the future except hope. Then the caravan returned with new men, chanting as they had chanted the day they arrived, and shouting as anxiously as they did, "Where is our king, Ahmose? And where is our mother, Tututuri? Where is our Prince Ahmose?" Then they joined the camp to work and train. The chamberlain, our Prince Ahmose, came and greeted him, then extended his hand to him with a letter and said, "I have been entrusted to bring this letter to your highness." As he took it, Ahmose asked him in astonishment, "Who sent it?" But Ha remained silent in silence, and then a thought occurred to the prince, and his heart skipped a beat. He opened the letter and read the signature, and his joints trembled and his heart tightened, and his eyes ran over the lines, and they were as follows. Merchantess Thebes. It saddens me to tell you that I chose one of your dwarfs to live with me in my private suite, and that I took care of him, fed him the most delicious food, clothed him in the most beautiful clothes, and treated him well, so that he became comfortable with me and I enjoyed him. Then I missed him one day and did not find him, so I ordered the maids to search for him, and they found that he had fled to his 2 brothers in the garden. I was hurt by his treachery and I turned away from him. Can you send me a new dwarf who knows loyalty? Ammon reads. As he finished reading the letter, Ahmose felt a sharp stab in his heart, and that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He glanced at Ha and saw him looking at him carefully, as if he was trying to understand the letter by looking at his face. So he turned away from him and went on his way, heartbroken and sad, telling himself, she cannot know what is preventing him from returning to her, and she cannot be able to one day broadcast his anger and emotions to her, and she will always see in him the dwarf lacking loyalty. He was immersed in his pain, and only those closest to him could feel what was raging in his heart. Nefertari. I was puzzled by his situation and amazed at what lay behind his stupor and distraction, and the look of sadness that appeared in his beautiful eyes whenever he looked away without intending anything. One evening she said to him, "You are not like I used to, Ahmose." He was disturbed to notice her, and he caressed her braids with his fingertips and said with a smile, "It is fatigue, my love. Do you not see the struggle we are in that is destroying the mountains?" She shook her head and did not say anything, and the young man became more cautious. However, Nabata would not let a person drown in his sadness, because work conquers sorrows, and she witnessed some of its miracles that she had never witnessed before or after. She would train men, make ships, wheels, and weapons, and send convoys laden with gold, which would return laden with men, then return them, and they would return to them. Long days and months passed until the expected happy day came, and King Ahmose went to his grandmother, Tututuri, and he could not contain his joy. He kissed her forehead and said in a shaking voice, "Good news, mother, the Salvation Army has been prepared." 2. The drums of departure sounded, and the army organized into teams, and the fleet raised its anchors. Tututuri called to her the king, the crown prince, the senior commanders, and the officers, and said to them, "This is one of the happy days that I have long awaited, so inform your brave soldiers that Tututuri begged them to free her captivity and break the chains that bind the necks of all of Egypt. May the motto of all of you be to live the life of Amenemhet or die the death of Sekenre. May the Lord Amun bless you and strengthen your hearts." So the men kissed her slender hand, and King Ahmose said to her as he bid her farewell, "Our motto will be the life of Amenemhet or the death of Sekenre, and whoever among us dies will die the most honorable death, and those of us who remain will live the dearest life. Naguib came out, led by the pharaonic family and the ruler, Raum, bidding farewell to the army. The drums beat and music played, and the army moved following its traditional order. It was led by a scout force carrying flags. King Ahmose walked at the forefront of the army amidst a halo of courtiers, veils, and pimps, followed by the pharaonic guards in their elegant chariots. Then a band advanced. The chariots move in rows and rows without the limit of sight. Their wheels emit a deafening clang in the air, and their horses neigh like the wind. Following them is the heavy band of knights with their bows, shields, and quivers of arrows, followed by carts of weapons and supplies, and tents guarded by knights. The fleet also sailed with its mighty ships, and the soldiers prepared for it with all their equipment from bows, spears, and swords. These forces advanced to the sound of music, igniting enthusiasm in their young, angry hearts, and their monkish appearance cast terror into the hearts and souls. They crisscrossed the day, striking the land, and fell asleep when darkness fell. They did not tire or become weary. They supported themselves through the hardships of the road and the length of the journey with resolves that would move mountains, so they passed on their way. Bosna, Bon, Epsichelis, Fatsis, and Nafs, and they continued to strike the land until they reached Debud, the last country in Nubia, and the good wind of Egypt blew on their faces, so they camped and set up tents to rest from the hardships of travel and gain their preparation for struggle. The king and his men planned the first invasion plan, and they were well planned. He entrusted Ahmose the father, who was the most skilled man of all the fleet, to lead part of the fleet to march it to the borders of Egypt, as it was a convoy that the guards were accustomed to crossing the borders in the last era. And at dawn on the fourth day of the army's arrival to Debud, it set sail. The small fleet reached the Egyptian border at dawn, and Ahmose was standing on the deck of the ship in loose merchant clothes. He showed the entry permit to the guards and entered with his fleet in peace. The officer knew that the border guard was composed of a few ships and a small garrison, so his plan was to surprise the safe ships. And seizing it, then laying siege around the island of Beja until the army and fleet enter the land of Egypt, making it easier for him to attack Sin when it takes away its power. The caravan advanced in a horizontal line, and when it approached the southern shore of Beja, where the shepherds' ships were anchored, the soldiers appeared on its deck with bows in their hands. Ahmose took off the merchant's cloak and appeared in officer's clothes. He ordered the shooting of arrows at the ship's guards. The fleet quickly approached the anchored ships and pounced on them before they could reach them. A group came to it from land, and threw its nets over it, and the soldiers jumped to its deck to seize it. They clashed with the few guards found there, in a small battle, and annihilated them in a short time. During this movement, Ahmose's ship was firing arrows at the shore guards and preventing the soldiers from helping their colleagues. In the ships were seized quickly without costing the attackers a heavy price. The fleet imposed a siege around the island to prevent communication with the northern cities. The Beja garrison was alerted to the sudden movement and rushed to the shore, but found itself trapped and its small fleet captive. Only a short time had passed after the end of the battle until the units of the Egyptian fleet appeared on the horizon, sailing through the water, heading towards the border. Then they crossed it without encountering resistance, and joined the fleet of Ahmose, so the island became in the middle of a circle of huge ships, which forced the Beja garrison to retreat to the heart of the island was far from the range of the fleet's arrows that rained down on it from all sides. It was not until the vanguards of the army entered the border and descended on the eastern side, followed by the armed squads, that the besieged people in Beja realized that the arrivals were invaders, not pirates, as they had initially imagined. Then the commander of the fleet, Kamkaf, issued his order to attack the island. The ships attacked it from all sides, and landed the heavily armed soldiers under the protection of Olkasi. The soldiers marched from all sides towards the besieged garrison in the middle, and its soldiers, until they were in a precise position, saw the influx of Egyptian forces. On land and the Nile, their forearms failed them and their courage betrayed them. They laid down their weapons, surrendered themselves, and were taken prisoner. Ahmose was at the head of the attackers. He entered the ruler's palace like a victor, raised Egyptian flags over it, and ordered the arrest of the shepherds' officials and notables, just like the soldiers. The people of the island, including peasants, workers, and servants, saw the Egyptian soldiers, and they could not believe their eyes. Women and men rushed to the palace of the new ruler and gathered in front of him to see what was the news. Hopes and fears rose in their souls. So Ahmose our father came out to them, and they looked at him in silence. He said to them, "May the Lord Amun, the protector of the Egyptians, bless you." And he conquered the shepherds. The word Amun fell upon their ears in a beautiful and magical way. They had been deprived of hearing it for 10 years. Their faces lit up with joy, and some of them asked, "Have you really come to save us?" Ahmose said to our father in a shaking voice, "We have come to save you and to save enslaved Egypt, so give good news. Do you not see these enormous forces? It is the Salvation Army, the army of our Lord King Ahmose, the son of our martyr King Sekenre, who came to liberate his people and regain his throne." So the people spoke Ahmose's name as if they were amazed. Then they were overwhelmed with joy and enthusiasm, so they chanted for him for a long time, and many knelt down and prayed to the worshipped Lord Amun, and some of the men asked Ahmose our father, saying, "Has our slavery really ended? Are we as free today as we were 10 years ago? Has the time of the whip and the stick and our being reproached for being peasants passed?" Then Ahmose our father became angry and said angrily, "Be confident that the era of oppression, slavery, and the whip has passed and will never return, and that from now on you will live as free masters under the care of our king, Ahmose, the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt. Your land and your homes will be returned to you, and those who usurp them this eternity will be thrown into the absence of prisons." The tormented souls were filled with joy, and they organized a comprehensive prayer in which supplications escalated to Amun in heaven and to Ahmose on earth. 3. In the early morning glory, King Ahmose, his crown Prince Ahmose, the Chamberlain Ha, and all the courtiers descended to the land of the island. The locals received him enthusiastically, and fell prostrate, kissing the ground before his hands. Their chants rose in remembrance of Siknir, Tutishuri, the king, and Prince Ahmose. Ahmose greeted them with his hands, and spoke to a large gathering of their men, women, and children. He ate what they offered him of bread and fruit, and he, his entourage, and his commander drank cups full of Mariat wine. They all went to the ruler's palace, and the king issued his order to appoint one of his loyal men, called Sammar, as governor of the island and entrusted him with spreading justice and implementing Egyptian laws. In that meeting, the commanders agreed to Sien must be surprised at dawn, to strike the final blow before she comes out of her stupor. The army slept early and woke up before dawn, then it marched towards the north with the fleet blocking the outlets of the Nile. It broke through the darkness and the stars. Yaka was awake and watching him with bright eyes, and anger was burning in the chests and they were eager for revenge and fighting. They approached Sion, and the darkness of the late night mixed with the shy blue light of the morning, and the horizon became clear. The eastern side of the sun rises, and Ahmose ordered the chariot forces to advance on the city from the south and east, supported by forces from the bow and spear divisions. He ordered his fleet to lay siege to the western coast of the city. The forces attacked the city from 3 directions at the same time, and the chariots were led by ancient officers. They knew the city and its locations, so they directed their vehicles towards the barracks and police stations, followed by infantry forces armed with weapons, inflicting a massacre on the enemy in which rivers of blood flowed. The shepherds were able to fight in some locations, so they defended themselves with a desperate defense, and they fell like dry autumn leaves blown by a stormy wind. As for the fleet, he met with resistance and did not meet any warships on his way, so he seized the beach and landed forces of his soldiers. They attacked the palaces overlooking the Nile and arrested their owners. Among them were the governor of the city, its judges, and senior notables. Then the forces penetrated the fields towards the city. Surprise was a decisive factor in the battle, which shortened its duration and caused many deaths from the shepherds. As soon as the sun rose above the horizon and sent its light into the city, crowds of invaders were seen occupying the barracks and palaces and carrying out the prisoners. Bodies were seen dumped in the roads and courtyards of the barracks. their blood flowing, and it spread throughout the city and the nearby fields. Kammu, son of Siknari, stormed Sin with a powerful army and took control of it. As a result, a bloody revolution broke out. The people attacked the homes of the shepherds, killed them in their rooms, mutilated them, and beat them severely with whips. Many of them fell on their faces in fear, as the Egyptians did when Apophis marched on the south with his chariots and men. Then souls calmed down and the army took control of the situation. King Kammu entered at the head of his army, with Egyptian flags waving on his head and the guard forces marching in front of him with their music. The people came to welcome him, and it was a glorious day. The officers reported to the king that a large number of young men, including those who were soldiers in the old army, were willing to volunteer for the army with great enthusiasm. Kammu was pleased and appointed one of his men named Shaw as governor of the city, and ordered him to organize volunteers and train them to join the army as ready soldiers. The commander counted to the king what they took spoils of carts and horses, and it was a great thing. Hyksos suggested to the king that they advance without delay so as not to give the enemy time to prepare and mobilize the armies, and he said, "We will fight the first real battle in Ahmose." Kammu said, "Yes, Horus, and it is not unlikely that dozens of fleeing people have now knocked on the doors of Ahmose, so there is no room for surprise anymore. We will meet our enemy prepared, and perhaps Apophis will be able to meet us with his brutal forces in Hyrcanus, so let us march." The Egyptian forces, land and Nile River, marched towards the north on the road to Ahmose, and entered many villages, but they did not meet any resistance at all, and they did not find a single man among the shepherds. The king learned that the enemy men were carrying their belongings and driving their animals, fleeing to Ahmose, and the peasants came out to receive the Salvation Army and salute their victorious king. They prayed for him from hearts invigorated with joy and hope. The army was on its way to the outskirts of Ahmose, and there the scouts came and decided that the enemy was camped south of the city ready to fight, and that a medium-sized fleet was anchored west of Ahmose. Kammu knew that the first important battle was approaching, and the king wished to know the number of his enemy's soldiers, but this was not possible for the scouting soldiers because the enemy was camping in a flat plain that was not easy to monitor. A young commander named Moab said, "I do not think, my lord, that Ahmose's strength exceeds a few thousand." King Kammu said, "Bring me every officer or soldier from Ahmose." The chamberlain, Awa, understood what the king wanted and said, "Excuse me, my lord. The face of Ahmose has changed in the past 10 years. Barracks were established there that were not there before. I saw them with my own eyes on some of my commercial trips, and it is likely that the shepherds made it a defense center for the country adjacent to the borders." Commander Moab said, "In any case, my lord, I think we should attack with light forces, so that we do not suffer a heavy loss." Prince Ahmose did not approve of this opinion, so he said to his father, "My lord, I see the opposite of this opinion. I see that we attack with heavy, irresistible forces, and that we throw most of our forces into the battle in order to strike the enemy with the final blow in the shortest time, and astonish the forces that are mobilizing in Thebes now to fight us, and we fight from tomorrow. Men who see death in our fight, and who have no fear in risking our soldiers. Our army will be multiplied by volunteers in every country we conquer, and our enemy will have no compensation for its loss." The king liked this opinion and said, "My men are willingly sacrificing themselves for Thebes." The king was aware of the decisive impact of the fleet's victory in winning the battle, due to the dangerous role it played in laying sieges on the shores of rich cities or landing soldiers in the enemy's rear, so he ordered Commander Kamkaf to attack the shepherds' ships anchored west of Ahmose. The two armies were separated only by a spacious field, and the shepherds were men of war and executioners, of valor and ability, and they underestimated the Egyptians with inherent disdain, so they began the attack while they were ignorant of their strength, and they sent against them a squad of chariots consisting of 100 chariots. And Kammu issued his order to attack, and forces of chariots rushed out. More than 300, and they closed in on the enemy force, so the horses neighed and played the bows, and fierce fighting took place, and Prince Ahmose was determined to completely eliminate the enemy. So he rushed with 200 new chariots on the infantry forces awaiting the outcome of the chariot battle in front of the gates of Ahmose, and forces from the bow division followed him. And another of those carrying spears, and the chariots pounced on the infantrymen, penetrating their ranks, throwing chaos and panic into them, and arrows raining down on them, scattering them among the wounded, the dead, and the fleeing, so the attacking infantry force met them in an irresistible multitude and finished them off in a final manner. And the enemy, who had not expected to meet such forces, was astonished. Outnumbered, his forces collapsed quickly, his knights fell and his wheels were destroyed, and the Egyptians took control of the field in an incredibly short time, after they fought with anger and fury, and struck with arms strengthened by inherited hatred and raging cynicism. Armed forces stormed the gates of Ahmose and forcefully entered them to occupy the barracks and clear them of the remains of enemy soldiers. The officers continued in the field organizing their teams and carrying the wounded and dead. King Ahmose stood in the middle of the field on his wheel, flanked by the commander, Prince Ahmose, to his right, and the chamberlain, to his left. News came to him that his fleet had attacked the enemy ships and attacked them violently, and that they had retreated in front of him without order. The king was pleased and said to those around him, smiling, "A successful start." Prince Ahmose, who was wearing disheveled clothes, a dusty face, and sweat dripping on his forehead, said, "I long to fight more terrifying battles." Ahmose said, giving his beautiful face a look of admiration, "You will not wait long." Then the king got off his wheel, and his men followed him. He walked slowly until he was among the corpses of the shepherds. He looked at them, and blood gushed from them, staining their white skin and tearing them with arrows and spears. Then he said, "Do not think that this blood is the blood of our enemies. Rather, it is the blood of our people that they absorbed and left to starve." Ahmose's face became dark with sadness, so he raised his head to the sky and muttered, "May your soul, Father, be in peace and happiness." Then he looked at those around him and said in a voice whose tones indicated strength and courage, "Our strength will be tested in 2 severe battles in Thebes and Hyksos. If we maintain victory in them, we will purify the nation of shepherds forever, and restore Egypt to the glorious era of Amenemhet. When will we stand this position over the corpses of the defenders of Hyksos?" The king turned to return to his wheel, and at that moment a corpse rose up from among the corpses with lightning speed, aimed a bow at the king and fired. It was not possible to prevent the judiciary or strike the killer before he fired, so the arrow hit the king's chest, and the men screamed in terror and shot arrows at the Hyksos. They rushed to the king with hearts filled with terror and pity, and a deep groan rose from Ahmose's chest. Then he staggered like a drunk and fell in the hands of his crown prince, and the prince shouted, "Bring a howdah and call the doctor." He leaned his head toward his father and said in a shaking voice, "Father, Father, can't you talk to us?" The doctor came in a hurry, bringing the howdah. They carried the king and put him to sleep on it with great care. The doctor knelt beside him and proceeded to take off the king's armor and jacket to reveal his chest. The courtiers surrounded the howdah in silence, focusing their eyes between the king's pale face and the doctor's hands. The news spread in the square and the noise spread. Then a heavy silence prevailed, as if annihilation had befallen that huge army. The doctor removed the arrow, and blood was flowing abundantly from the wound. The king's face constricted in pain, and the prince's eyes darkened with sadness, and murmured, saying, "Oh my God, the king is in pain." The man washed the wound and put grass on it, but the king did not seem to feel any improvement, and his limbs trembled visibly. Then he sighed deeply and opened his eyes, and a dark look appeared in them that did not indicate life. Ahmose's chest became more constricted, and he said to himself complaining, "You have changed so much, my father." The king moved his eyes until they settled on Ahmose's face, and a smile appeared in them, and he said in a weak, barely audible voice, "I thought a while ago that I was an adult, Horus, but the Lord wants my journey to end at the gates of Ahmose." Ahmose shouted in his sad voice, "I sacrifice my soul for you, father." Then the king said in his weak voice, "No, take care of yourself, for there is greater need for you, and be more careful than me, and always remember that it is not permissible for you to stop fighting until Horus, the last fortress of the shepherds, falls, and the people are evacuated from all of our homes." The doctor was afraid for the king because of the effort he was making in speaking and advised him to remain silent, but the king was absorbed in a sublime feeling that was the difference between annihilation and immortality, so he said in a voice whose tone changed and seemed strange in tone, "Tell Totisheri that I have joined my father as valiant as him." He extended his hand to his son, and the prince knelt down and hugged it to his chest. The king held his shoulder for a moment to bid him farewell, then his fingers relaxed and he surrendered his soul. 4. The doctor laid down the corpse, and the men prostrated around it and prayed the farewell prayer, then they rose as if drunk with grief. The chamberlain, Hoa, summoned the commander of the divisions and the senior officers. When they appeared before him, he addressed them, saying, "Comrades, I regret, and it is God's right, to mourn for you our valiant King Ahmose, for he was martyred in the field. The struggle and for the sake of Egypt, just as his father was martyred before, and he moved to the side of Osiris, extracted from the core of our souls, after he advised us not to stop fighting until Hawaii falls and the enemy evacuates from our homes, and I, as the guardian of this honorable family, condole you in our great affliction, and give you permission to take office as our new king and leader. The glorious Ahmose bin Ahmose bin Siknari, may the Lord protect him and support him with clear victory." The commander saluted the body of Ahmose and bowed to Ahmose, the new king, and the bailiff allowed them to return to their soldiers to announce the death and succession. Hor ordered the soldiers to raise the royal howdah on their necks, and he was overcome with grief, and he said while drying his eyes, "May your exalted soul enjoy bliss and peace in the presence of Osiris. You were about to enter Ahmose at the head of your victorious army, but the Lord decreed that you enter it carried on your coffin, and you are the most generous of us to now." The army entered Ahmose in its traditional order, led by the coffin of King Ahmose, and the tragic news had spread to the entire city, so the joy of victory and the agony of sadness were drunk in one drink. And large crowds came from everywhere to receive the Salvation Army and bid farewell to their late king with hearts torn between joy and sadness. And when the people saw the king, the new Ahmose prostrated in silence and reverence, and no cheers were ever raised on that day. The priests of Ahmose received the great body, and Ahmose remained alone, so he wrote a letter to Tutichiri, as his father had instructed him, and sent it with a messenger. The reconnaissance messengers brought good and unfortunate news about the fleet. They said, the Egyptian fleet defeated the shepherd's fleet and captured some of its units, but the commander Kamkaf fell dead, and that officer Ahmose turned the tide of the battle after the fall of the commander, and won the final victory. He killed the shepherd's commander with his own hand in a violent battle, and the king wanted to reward Ahmose as a father, so he issued his order to appoint him to command the fleet. He followed his father's wise policy, and his friend Ham assumed the rule of Ahmose, entrusting him with organizing it and recruiting the ablest of its people. The king said to her, "We will advance with our forces quickly, because if the shepherds torture our people in a time of peace, they will double their torment in a time of war, so we must shorten the era of torment as much as we can." Effort. The king summoned the ruler Ham, and said to him in front of his courtiers and his commander, "Know that I vowed to myself from the day I sought the land of Egypt in the clothes of merchants to make Egypt for the Egyptians. Let this be your motto in governing this country, let it be your goal to purify it of eggs, for from now on, only an Egyptian will rule, and only an Egyptian will rule, and the land is the land of Pharaoh and the farmers are his representatives in investing it. They have what is sufficient for them and a prosperous life is guaranteed for them, and he has what he has in excess of their needs that he spends for the public good, and the Egyptians are equal before the law. Only his virtue raises a brother among them, and there is no slave in this country except the shepherds. Finally, I entrust you with my father's body, so perform its sacred duty for it." 5. The army left Ahmose at dawn, the fleet sailed, and the vanguards proceeded to enter the villages, where they received the warmest and most beautiful reception until they approached to Polypolis of Megana, where they prepared for a new battle. But the vanguards did not meet any resistance and entered the city safely. The fleet units were descending with the waters of the Nile in a favorable wind, finding no trace of the enemy ships. So Hor, naturally cautious, advised the king to send some of his scouting forces to the eastern fields for fear that they would fall into an ambush, and the army and fleet became trapped. Apoptopolis of Megana, and they left it at dawn, and the king and his guards were marching at the front of the army behind the reconnaissance forces, and to the right of the king was the wheel of the chamberlain Hor, surrounded by courtiers who were experts in the nature of the country, and King Hor asked, "Are we not now marching to Hyrcanpolis?" The chamberlain said, "Yes, my lord. It is the center of the front defense of Thebes itself, and the first intense battle between two equal forces will erupt in its valley." At noon came scouting news that the Egyptian fleet clashed with a fleet of shepherds who, due to its size and the large number of its units, thought it was the enemy's entire fleet, and that the battle was taking place with force and violence. The king turned his head toward the west, and hope appeared on his beautiful face. Ha said, "The shepherds, my lord, are new to fleet warfare." So the king remained silent and did not answer, and the sun continued to rise to the middle of the sky and the army advanced with its divisions and equipment. So Ahmose surrendered to contemplation and thinking, and he pictured his family receiving the news of Ahmose's death, and how his mother Sichimose was terrified. And his grandmother Ahatep was upset, and the patient mother Tutishuri groaned, and his wife Nefertari, who became queen of Egypt, cried, "Oh my God! Ahmose had fallen treacherously, his army had lost his valor and knowledge, and he had bequeathed to him a legacy burdened with solemn duties." Then his imagination ran forward, to Thebes, where Apophis reigned and the people were suffering all kinds of torment and humiliation. He mentioned Kunzar, the formidable and valiant ruler whose soul would not calm down until he avenged his martyred grandfather and killed him. Then Princess Amenrides came to his mind, and he mentioned the cabin in which their passion had brought them to a sacred fire, and he wondered, "Are you still attached to the beautiful merchantess Phoenix and hoping that he will keep his promise to her?" Here, Horkofton reminded him that he should not look forward to Amenrides, who was at the head of the army advancing to purify Egypt of its people. He wanted to expel the thought, so he cast his gaze on his huge army, whose horizon reached the ground but not its rear, so he walked away from it and returned to thinking about the battle taking place in the Nile. At midday, reconnaissance messengers came saying that the two fleets were engaged in fierce fighting, that there were many deaths on both sides, and that the two forces were still tied so that it was impossible to predict the outcome of the battle. A frown appeared on the king's face and he did not hide his concern, so Ha said, "There is no need to worry. My lord, the shepherd's fleet is a force to be reckoned with, and our fleet is now fighting the decisive battle on the Nile." Ahmose said, "If we lose it, we will lose half the war." Ha said with certainty, "If we win it, my lord, as I expect, we will win the whole war." The army was a few hours away from Hyrcanpolis, so it was necessary to stop to rest and prepare. However, he had barely stayed for a short time when news came that the vanguards were fighting scattered forces from the enemy army. Ahmose said, "The shepherds are resting, and there is no doubt that they welcome clashing with us now." The king ordered sending a force of chariots to support the reconnaissance forces if they were attacked by forces superior in numbers. He summoned his commanders and ordered them to prepare to go into battle at any time. Ahmose felt the dangerous responsibility he was bearing by leading the army for the first time in his life, and he felt that he was the protector of this great army and responsible for the fate of Egypt forever, so he said to her, "We must direct our strength to smash the wheels of the shepherds." The chamberlain said, "This is what both armies will try, and if we destroy the enemy's wheels and control the field, the army will be at the mercy of our priest." At that hour, while Ahmose was preparing to go into battle, a messenger came from the side of the Nile and told the king that the Egyptian fleet had received severe blows. Ahmose saw that our father would retreat with his basic units to reorganize them, and that the fighting was continuing at its most intense. The young man became worried and feared the loss of his great fleet, but he could not find any help. He took some time to think when he was told that the enemy army had begun its attack. He greeted her and the entourage, advanced with his guard, and ordered the Will squad to attack. So the army attacked in the heart and on two wings. They rushed in close rows with speed and noise that shook the earth with an earthquake. They soon saw the army of shepherds advancing, charging like a stormy wind in dense masses of wheels. They knew that their enemy was attacking them with his brutal forces that had always poisoned them. Anger arose in their souls and they shouted in a voice like the crash of thunder. The life of Amenemhat or the death of Sikneh, and they threw themselves into the battle with hearts thirsting for battle and revenge. The two teams fought with strength, cruelty, and brutality. The ground was soaked with blood, and the shouting of the soldiers was mixed with the neighing of horses and the howling of the bowmen. The fighting continued harsh and violent until the sun tilted toward the horizon and melted into a lake of blood, and the ghosts of darkness flew in the space, so the two armies stopped and each returned to his camp, and Ahmose was walking in the middle of a circle of his guards who defended him during his hatred and flight. And his men received him with a poplar on his head, and he said to them, "It was a fierce fight that cost us valiant heroes." Then the king asked, "Did you not find any news about the battle of the Nile?" The chamberlain said, "The two fleets are still fighting." "Anything new about our fleet?" Ha said, "He fought during the day while retreating. Then most of the ships joined the enemy units by the ladders and were unable to separate when darkness fell, and the fighting is still continuing and we are waiting for the news we find." The king's tired face frowned, and he said to those around him, "Let us all pray to God to grant victory to our brothers who are fighting on the Nile." 6. The army woke up with the dawn and began to prepare, and the eyes brought important news, and they said, "The movement did not remain all night in the enemy's camp." And some of those who risked penetrating into the fields surrounding the battlefield decided that new forces of men and vehicles had been pouring into Hyksos throughout the night and that their flow until just before dawn. Ha thought carefully and then said, "The enemy, my lord, is gathering the bulk of his forces for us here to meet us with his entire army, and I am not surprised by that because if we storm the gates of Hyksos, nothing will hinder our progress except the glorious walls of Thebes." Good news came from the side of the Nile. The king learned that his fleet had fought a desperate fight, but his enemy had not been able to defeat him as he wished. On the contrary, he had expelled his soldiers from many of his ships after they had set foot on them, so the shepherd's fleet was forced to separate from it, having lost a third of its strength. The two fleets stopped fighting for hours. Then they clashed in a new battle shortly after dawn, and the fleet of Ahmose was the first to attack, so the king's chest was lifted and he jumped up to fight with a joyful heart. When dawn broke, the two armies advanced to fight, and the rows of chariots appeared, and the Egyptians shouted their well-known cry, "Amenemhat lives, or Sikneh dies." Then they presented themselves in the battlefield of death, not resorting to anything. They met the enemy in deadly shocks, and they became fierce against him, just as he was fierce against them. They fought with bows, spears, and swords, and the king noticed. Ahmose, despite the intensity of the fighting, found that the heart of the enemy army was managing the battle with great skill and sending troops here and there with regularity and precision. He looked at the skilled commander and found that he was not the ruler of Hyksos. King Ahmose himself, who had given him the jeweled crown in the palace of Thebes, with his fat body, long beard, and keen eyesight, was motivated. Ahmose was subjected to severe attacks, and he fought like a valiant hero while his guard repelled the enemy's attacks. He did not meet a knight from among the people except that he shunted him in the blink of an eye, until they were afraid of fighting him and despaired of defeating him. The fighting continued for a long time, and new forces rushed to the field from both sides, so the fighting continued despite its violence and intensity. Until the day was about to end, and at that hour, when the forces of both sides were exhausted, a force of herdsmen's chariots attacked the Egyptians' left flank, led by a very valiant man, and put intense pressure on it, to which the exhausted resistance was of no use, and proceeded to create a gap for itself from which it would rush to surround the fighting forces or to attack the infantry. Ahmose realized that this brave leader had found a suitable opportunity in their fatigue, and that he had saved his strength to strike a fatal blow. He feared that the man would achieve his goal and cause chaos in the compact ranks of his army, or cause a massacre among his infantry. He decided to break into the heart of the enemy with his force to restrict it, and the shrewd commander found himself almost besieged. He did not hesitate because the situation was dangerous and delicate, so he ordered his soldiers to attack the heart with a sudden, powerful movement. The fighting intensified to a horrific and frightening degree, and the enemy was forced to retreat under the intense pressure, and at that time Ahmose sent a force of chariots to encircle the force that was strengthening on his left flank, but the commander was clever and brilliant. So he modified his plan after he almost made the required gap and threw a small force from his wheels to attack the enemy. He and the rest of the force quickly retreated to his army. During this delicate operation, Ahmose was able to see the intrepid leader and recognize in him Kunzar, the mighty ruler of the south, with his solid build and steel muscles. His mighty attack cost the Egyptians the deaths of many of the charioteer knights, and the fighting ended shortly after that. So the king and his army returned to their camp, and Ahmose was saying in an angry threat, "We must meet, swine, face to face." His men received him with prayers, and he found a new person among them. Eabani got excited and was optimistic about his presence in the camp and asked him, "What is behind you, commander?" Ahmose said to our father, "Victory, my lord. We have inflicted defeat on the shepherd's fleet. We captured 4 large ships from its units and sank half of it. Ships fled that were neither sufficient nor helpful." The king's face beamed, and he put his hand on the commander's shoulder and said, "With this victory, you have won half the war for Egypt, and I am very proud of you." Then Ahmose's face turned red and he said with pleasure, "There is no doubt, my lord, that we paid a high price for the victory, but we now have absolute sovereignty over the Nile." The king said in a sober tone, "We have inflicted a great loss on the enemy. I fear we will not find a compensation for it, and victory in this war goes to whoever destroys his enemy's knights." The king was silent for a moment, then added, "Our rulers in the south are training soldiers and building ships and chariots, but training charioteer knights requires a long time. Nothing will benefit us in the battle in which we are fighting except our courage so that our infantry will not face the enemy's chariots again." 7. The army woke up again at the beginning of dawn and began to be alert and prepared. The king put on his military uniform and received his men in his tent and said to them, "My resolve to duel a pig has been confirmed." Ha was startled by this statement and said with great hope, "My lord, a stray blow must not paralyze our glorious work." Each commander begged the king to allow him to fight the ruler of the south, but Ahmose thanked them and said to her, "No one will paralyze our work, even if he is great, and he will not be hindered by my death if I am struck. My army does not lack commanders, nor does my country lack men, and I would not have it lost from my hands. An opportunity to confront the killer of Sekenre, so let me fight him until I kill him to repay a debt in my neck towards a generous soul watching over me from the western world. May the curse of the Lord descend upon those who hesitate and fail." The king sent an officer to present his desire to his opponent, so the man stepped into the field and shouted, "O enemy, the Pharaoh of Egypt desires to duel Commander Kanzar to settle an old score." Then a man from Kanzar's battalion appeared to him. "Tell the one you call Pharaoh, a leader does not deny an enemy the honor of dying by his sword." So Ahmose mounted the back of a noble horse, put the sword in its holder and the spear in its holster, and poked it, so they returned to the field, and saw his enemy riding towards him on a proud, grey-haired horse whose body looked like a mighty block of granite, so they approached little by little until the heads of their horses almost touched. And each of them looked at him. His opponent, Kanzir, could not help but look surprised on his face and shouted strangely, "Oh my God, who do I see in front of me? Isn't Thebes the merchant of dwarfs and pearls? What a joke, where is your business, merchant Thebes?" Ahmose was looking at him calmly and said to him, "Thebes is finished, Commander Kanzar, and I have no business now except this." He pointed to his sword, and Pig got emotional and asked him, "Who are you then?" Ahmose said simply and calmly, "Ahmose is the Pharaoh of Egypt." Kanzar laughed loudly, and it rang out in the square. He said sarcastically, "Who is the ruler of Egypt, and this is its king, carrying the double crown that you gave him as a gift, prostrating?" Ahmose said, "I am the one who took care of my fathers and grandfathers before, so know, O leader, that the one who will fight you is the grandson of Sekenre." Then a serious look appeared on the ruler's face and he said calmly, "Siknari. I remember that man who had the misfortune of one day being forced to fight with me. I almost understand everything, so excuse my slowness in my understanding. We, the Hyksos, are heroes of the field, we are not good at cunning, and we only know the language of the sword. As for you, the Egyptian pretenders to the king, you hide for a long time in the clothes of merchants before your courage enables you to wear the clothes of kings. So be it as you wish, but do you wish to duel with me, Esphines?" Ahmose said sharply, "Let us wear whatever clothes we want, for they are our clothes. As for you, you did not learn to wear clothes until Egypt took you in. And do not call me Esphines as long as you know that I am Ahmose, son of Ahmose, son of Siknari, a family ancient in nobility and antiquity that descended from the origins of the glorious Thebes, and did not know wandering in the deserts, nor herding flocks, and I truly desire to duel you, and it is an honor you gain to pay a debt on my neck towards the most precious person I have ever known." Pig shouted, saying, "I see that vanity blinds you from knowing your own worth, so you thought that your victory over the leader Rook was a justification for standing before me, so have mercy on you, you badger young man. What do you choose as your weapon?" Ahmose said, with a sarcastic smile on his mouth, "A sword, if you wish." Pig said, shaking his broad shoulders, "He is my best friend." Kunzar got off his horse and handed over his leadership to his subordinate. Then he unsheathed his sword and grabbed his shield. Ahmose did the same, and they stood silently, separated by an arm's length. Then Ahmose asked, "Shall we begin?" Pig said, laughing, "How beautiful are these situations in which life and death unfold. Come on, boy." The king rose up and bravely attacked his huge opponent, inflicting a severe blow on him, which the ruler struck on his shield. Then he responded to the attack while he was speaking, saying, "What an honest blow, O Esphines, and I only think that the ringing of your sword on my shield sings the tune of death. Hooray! Hooray! My chest welcomes the messengers of death, for death has always coveted, and I play between its claws, and then it recoils." He was disappointed in me, and he finally realized that he had only come for someone else. The man was fighting without stopping talking, as if he were a skilled dancer, singing while dancing. Then Ahmose realized that his opponent was stubborn, extremely strong, strong-muscled, resourceful, agile in movement, and mighty in attack and flight. He exerted all his strength and knowledge, and dodged the blows directed at him, knowing that they were fatal blows with no escape from them if they hit their target. However, he received a blow with his shield. He felt its weight, and saw his opponent smiling with confidence and reassurance. He was aroused by anger and rage, and he dealt him a massive blow, which the man in turn received on his shield. He was controlling his nerves and his will, so he asked Ahmose, "Where was this strong sword made?" Ahmose said to him, and he was able to control himself as well, "In Nabata in the far south." The man said as he avoided a severe blow directed at him with great skill, "As for my sword, it was made in Memphis by the hands of Egyptian craftsmen, and its maker did not know that he was presenting to me what I would decree for his king who traded and fought for him." Ahmose said, how happy he would be tomorrow if he knew that it was ominous for the enemy of his country. Amarson was waiting for the opportunity to launch a violent attack. He had barely finished speaking when he directed 3 successive blows at his mighty opponent with lightning speed. Kunzar defended them with his shield and sword, but he was forced to retreat a few steps. The king jumped on him and attacked him harshly, directing blow after blow to his fighter. Kunzar realized the danger of his fate. So he stopped caressing his opponent and closed his mouth, and the smile disappeared from him, so he furrowed his brow and defended his enemy's attacks with tremendous strength and tremendous valor, and he showed forms of skill and courage that exceed all imagination, and his sword flies hit Ahmose's helmet. So the shepherds thought that he had eliminated their stubborn enemy, so their cheering grew so loud that Ahmose wondered for a moment. "I wonder if you were injured." But he did not feel helpless or weak, so he gathered himself and struck his enemy with a strong, violent blow. He exposed his shield and struck him harshly. He let it fall from his hand, weakened, and his forearm trembled. Cheering rose from both sides, between joy and anger. Ahmose stopped fighting and looked at his opponent with a triumphant smile, and the other was brandishing his sword. He was getting ready to fight without a shield, so Ahmose took off his shield and threw it aside. Pig's face appeared in astonishment and he looked at him with a strange look as he said, "What true nobility he has with the morals of kings." They resumed the fight in silence, and they exchanged 2 severe blows, but Ahmose's blow was quicker to the neck of his mighty opponent, causing a tremendous tremor in him, and his hand slackened off the hilt of his sword, and then he fell to the ground as if a structure had been destroyed. The king approached him in slow steps, and looked at his face with an eye full of respect and said to him, "What a valiant tyrant you are, Governor Kanzar." The man said as he breathed his last breath of life, "You have spoken the truth, O king, and no fighter will stand in your way after me." Ahmose took a pig sword and placed it next to his body. Then he mounted his horse and returned to his camp. He knew that the shepherds would fight with fury and a desire for revenge, so he turned to his knights and shouted to them, "O soldiers, repeat our immortal slogan, Amenemhet lives or Sekenre dies. And remember that our fate is the outcome of this ongoing battle is forever pending. Never accept that the patience of years and the effort of generations be wasted in the failure of 1 hour." Then they carried, and the fighting took place fiercely until sunset. The fighting continued in this manner for 10 full days. 8. On the evening of the 10th day of the fighting, King Ahmose returned from the field, tired and exhausted. He met with his entourage and his commander. The fall of a pig had inflicted an irreparable loss on the army of shepherds, but their group of chariots continued to resist and repel the attacks of the Egyptians, inflicting heavy losses on them. The king became worried and feared that the mighty band of chariots was being destroyed day after day, and that evening he was angry and sad because of the many fallen of his brave knights who faced death indifferently, so he said as if he was talking to himself, "Hyrcanpolis. Hyrcanpolis. I wonder if your name is associated with our victory or our defeat." Those gathered were no less sad or angry than the king, but they were taken aback by the fatigue and emotion that appeared on his beautiful face. The chamberlain, said, "My lord, our knights are fighting the shepherd's chariot squad in full numbers and equipment, so do not be alarmed by our losses. Tomorrow, if we appear against the enemy and destroy his chariots, there will be no his infantry has come before us, and they will seek refuge within the walls of the fortress to escape the attack of our chariots on them." The king said, "My greatest goal was to annihilate the enemy's forces while maintaining a great force of ours to always control the field, as the shepherds did in their attack on Thebes, but I became afraid that our 2 forces riding together would be annihilated. And we would be exposed to a long-term war that would not spare our cities or destroy them." The king asked to see the latest statistics of the losses, and an officer came and found that the Egyptian chariot squad had lost 2/3 of its chariot and cavalry strength. So Ahmose looked at the faces of his men, and saw faces towering over them all. Then he said, "We only have 2,000 knights left. So how do you estimate the enemy's losses?" Commander Thebes said, "I do not imagine, my lord, that it is less than our loss, and most likely it is more than it." So the king bowed his head and thought carefully, then he looked at his men and said, "Everything will be known tomorrow, for tomorrow is the day of separation without a doubt, and perhaps our enemy suffers from as much confusion and anxiety as we suffer and more, and in any case no one will blame us and we will not blame anyone. And the Lord knows that we fight with hateful hearts. For life." Dib said, wondering, "Our fleet is not fighting now, so why does it not send soldiers behind the enemy army between Hyrcanpolis and Nokba?" Ahmose our father said, "Our fleet has now taken complete control of the Nile, but we cannot risk landing soldiers behind the enemy unless his entire army is engaged in combat. In fact, the fighting has so far been limited to the 2 chariot divisions, while the enemy's army is lying behind the field, resting and alert." One of the priests of Ahmose asked, "O Lord, do we not have a reserve force of knights?" Ahmose said, "We came to Egypt with 6,000 knights, the result of a hard struggle and long patience, but we lost 4,000 men of them in 12 days of hell." Ha said, My lord, Sion, Ahmose, Apollinopolis, and Megna are building wheels and training the knights without fail. As for Ahmose our father, he said with his enthusiasm that did not know despair, we have sufficed with our motto that the Holy Mother Tutashiri taught us, live a menem hit or disekenre, and that our cavalry will not be defeated, and that our infantry will be eager to fight. And let us always remember that the Lord who sent you to the land of Egypt did not send you in vain. The men believed in what the young commander said, and the king smiled brightly, and the army spent the night and woke up with the dawn as usual and prepared to fight, and at the dawn of the morning the band of chariots advanced, with the king and his guards in its heart, and he looked at the field and saw it empty and was extremely astonished. Then he looked closely and saw walls in the distance. No one of the shepherds could obstruct his way to Hyrcanpolis, and the king was not long in astonishment. Some reconnaissance men came to him and decided in his hands that the army of Apophis had withdrawn from the field in large numbers and left Hyrcanpolis at night. He began marching towards the north, and Commander Moheb could not help but say, now the truth has been decided. There is no doubt that the strength of the shepherd's wheels was broken, and that Abu Face preferred to flee to his fortresses rather than confront our knights with his infantry. Commander Thebes said with joy, my lord, we have won the massive battle of Hyrcanpolis. King Ahmose was wondering, has the cloud lifted? Have the fears really disappeared? Then he turned to Dib and said, rather, say that we destroyed the shepherd's wheels and that is enough. The news spread to the army, and joy spread in their souls. The courtiers, led by Ha, rushed to the king and congratulated him on the clear victory that the Lord had won over him. Ahmose entered the city of Hyrcanpolis at the head of his army, and the people rushed with him from the fields to it, fleeing to it for fear of the shepherd's revenge, and they received their king with a warm welcome. They gave the Salvation Army a loud cheer. The first thing the king did was to pray to the Lord Amun, who extended a helping hand to him after he almost recovered from despair. 9. The army rested in Hyrcanpolis for a few days after fierce fighting that lasted 12 days, and Ahmose personally supervised the organization of the city and the restoration of its early Egyptian government, farms, markets, and temples. He consoled the people for the types of persecution they were subjected to and what their city was exposed to during the retreat of the shepherds through plunder, and sabotage. Then the army marched towards the north, and the fleet sailed with it and entered the city of Naguib in the afternoon of the same day without resistance, and stayed there until dawn on the second day. Then it resumed its march without meeting any enemy forces, so it occupied the villages and raised Egyptian flags over them, and approached the Letopolis valley after 3 days, and the king was and his men thought that the enemy would defend it, so Ahmose sent the vanguards of his army to it, and Ahmose besieged its western shores. But the vanguards entered the city without resistance, so the army entered it safely. The people told them how the army of Apophis passed by them carrying his wounded, and how the shepherds who owned houses and farms carried their furniture and money and joined their king's army in a severe state of panic and chaos. The army advanced with its terrified forces, entering the villages and cities without the slightest resistance until it reached Tart, and then Hesmantis. They were all eager to meet their enemy in order to heal their sorrows, but happiness shone in their faces whenever they raised the flag over a town or village and felt that they had liberated a piece of their beloved homeland. The news of the defeat that befell the band of shepherd wheels revived the souls of the soldiers and kindled hope and enthusiasm in their hearts, so they continued to sing enthusiastic songs and beat the valley floor with their copper legs, until they saw the walls of Medinet Habu penetrating into the Thebes region. And the valley was descending towards its south in a sudden and severe decline, so the vanguards went to the city, but it was like the previous cities without guards, so the army entered it in peace. Habu's entry shook the hearts of all the soldiers because it and Thebes were like members of one body, and because many of the army's soldiers were from its brave sons, so hearts and souls embraced in its squares and consciences chanted songs of longing and nostalgia. Then he advanced. The army headed north with keen hearts and eager souls, knowing that it was heading toward the decisive action in its history and the dangerous battle that would decide the fate of Thebes. It descended into the great valley that the Thebans called the Way of Amun, and it expanded as they delved deeper into it until it seemed to them that the great wall with multiple gates was cutting off the road. Over them, it extends east and west, behind which emanate obelisks, temple walls, and towering buildings, all of which represent glory and eternity, and great memories that float through them. A storm of enthusiasm and nostalgia swept from them to the souls, shaking hearts and consciences, so the sides of the valley shouted, "Good, good." Her name was on every tongue and agitated hearts, and they continued to chant until tears ran down their pride, so they cried and Sheikh cried. The great army camped, and Ahmose stood in his heart, fluttering over his head the flag of Thebes that Tututuri had woven with her hands. He looked at the city with dreams in them and said, "Thebes, Thebes, O land of glory, and the resting place of fathers and grandfathers. Rejoice, for tomorrow a new morning will rise upon you."